Hello, I'm Alexander Chee. I'm the author most recently of the essay collection, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, and I was a judge for Aspen Words. It's my great pleasure to talk today to Bryan Washington, the author of Lots, which is one of our finalists. And I am thinking I would begin with a question that so it's a collection of stories, but it's not like most collections of stories that you will find. And so this first question then, I suppose, is aimed a little bit at, I'm curious and have been curious all along, how, Bryan, you came to this form. If you found the characters first, or the stories first, or even the idea of the whole collection first.
Yeah, well, thanks first, Alex, to you for being here, and also to the Aspen folks for having me. Regarding that, it was originally character and voice that drew me to the narration. I think that the first story that I wrote for the collection was Navigation, and what drew me to most of the rest of the stories, or at least the connected stories, was trying to figure out what made that particular character tick and what their family looked like, what their community looked like, why they were the way that they were. And that sort of led from one narrative thread to another narrative thread to another narrative thread. So I think conceptually, I didn't have the notion of an interconnected collection in mind, or the idea of a sort of structurally looser novel in mind, but through editing and as the stories began to take shape in proximity to one another, it was something that definitely surfaced. But that took quite a lot of time for it to make sense, at least to me.
That's a fascinating vision of it. I think for those of you who don't know the book, this collection it's set in Houston. I think could you tell them a little bit more about this particular story that started you off?
Yeah, so the story of Navigation, I think that I was at a taqueria in East End, which is a part of Houston that's relatively close to downtown. And this was maybe now I think like 6 years ago, like 5 or 6 years ago. And I saw these two guys flirting at the register, and I just sort of thought, like that's interesting, right? And it was something that sort of, just the image of that had sort of lingered long enough for me to think that there could be a narrative there. Usually when I start stories, it's a conversation between two folks or however many folks, just lines of dialogue pinging back and forth from one another. So really the genesis of the book was just a conversation, like this imaginary conversation between these two people that like I had never met and that I likely will never meet. And from that, around the same time, I was thinking of what a series of narratives, even if they were autonomous from one another, that were set in Houston would look like, because I just hadn't seen much contemporary fiction that was not just set in Houston, but featured the communities that I live close to, the communities and the folks that are near and dear to me. It was just not something that I had seen a lot of. And both of those ideas were sort of percolating in the back of my head whilst I was thinking of this original conversation that I was thinking of. And much of the book grew from trying to see what that would look like. I don't know that when I started writing those stories, I could have conceived of what it ultimately became. And I certainly didn't envision it being the book that I ended up with. But in the end, it's mostly interconnected stories set across various neighborhoods within the city. A friend of mine calls them just like failed love stories, just like a bunch of failed love stories that are set in the city, which is it's a descriptor that I'm quite all right
with. Stories of failed love, or love stories that have failed?
That's a good question. What's the difference between the two, right? Like every love story comes to an end, even if it's just a terminal natural one. But I think that what was most interesting to me, for a lot, and I think that something that's been like a recurring theme that I'm interested in are both pleasure and connection, right? The ways in which people connect across communities, across physical, literal proximity, which I think is really relevant in a city like Houston, where there's so much sprawl, and also like what pleasure can look like. Like, what does a relationship look like when you have to cross so many different boundaries, be they liminal or government imposed, in order to make something happen? And I think that's a thread that jumps from story to story in different capacities. And it certainly wasn't like a didactic effort. Like, I didn't write that down and say, okay, I'm going to try and do that. But it's something that became significantly more visible once I saw everything together, and as other people told me that that was what they saw.
Now, tell us a little bit about how you came to the character and the story that you're going to read an excerpt from today.
So the bit that I'm going to read from today is a conversation between two characters. One of them is the recurring narrator for the duration of the collection, and the other character is someone that he works with, someone that he's never really viewed as being a partner, being a life partner, or just a sexual partner for a temporary period of time. But over the course of this particular story, they get quite close, and they have moments of intimacy that aren't always explicitly physical until they ultimately are or aren't.
All right, well, I will let you take it away.
Yeah, thanks. So the story is called Elgin. It's the last story in the book, but I don't know that it really gives anything away. I asked Miguel if he's heard from his parents, and he doesn't look my way. He just keeps chewing his food. But eventually he says that they're fine. They made it back to their town, he says, but they don't have a phone. They call from the market in the square, and all you hear are the fucking roosters. And I say, that sounds like a terrible time. And Miguel says it's what they know. And I say, maybe one day they'll wake up. And Miguel says, maybe. And then Miguel runs his fingers across the table between us. And that's when I ask him the question that I've been meaning to ask him, the one that's on both of our minds. And I say, do you think that they'll miss it here in Houston? And Miguel finally looks up at me. And he says, you go somewhere else, and then you stay there, and then you go back home. And then you can tell me how they're feeling. And I say, I just might. Miguel says, you should have gone with your mother. You're being a little bitch about this. You're not making any sense. And I say, just like you should have flown back to the jungle with your parents, but you're still here. And I knock on the wood between us. Miguel says, I'm still here. And then he also, and the truth is that he could still go. Miguel could catch a flight and he could leave tomorrow. And I know that I could too. I could just pack my shit and just go. And it would cost nothing at all. But the same way that I know this, I know that I probably won't. I know that even if we don't always do the things that need to be done, we do the things that we need to do. And I know this the same way that I know that Miguel is beside me in this room, standing where my mother, my father, my brother, and my sister have in the years and the days before. Miguel keeps an arm's length away as we walk from the kitchen to the living room, and he peeps the photos on the wall, and he asks if the boy in the sweater is my brother. And he says, I could hardly tell, squinting at the photos. He says, you don't look anything like him.
Thank you. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the way in which a collection of stories can address a community in a way that a novel maybe can't.
I think that that's something that I'm trying to still extrapolate on my end, right? Because when I wrote this collection, or rather when I finished this collection, I hadn't written a novel. I thought that writing a novel would be unimaginable, just like this endeavor that I would never do. But now, you know, I have written a novel, and both of them at least attempt to maintain conversations between communities that might be thought of as disparate at a first glance. And I think that the largest difference in terms of structure for both of them would be the distance between the voices, right? Because when I was thinking and writing a lot, each of the voices in the back of my head as I was writing them were connected in a sort of implicit way. But as I was writing each narrative, that narrative was autonomous and it stood on its own until I completed that narrative. And it was only after I finished the collection that I sort of went about trying to make them work together, right? Like that was, I think, the toughest endeavor that my editor and I undertook, and my agent and I undertook, trying to make all of these stories that are in the same physical space make sense on a thematic level. Whereas, like with the novel, or at least in my immediate experience, I wasn't able to keep the relationship between those voices on the back burner. They all had to relate to one another in some capacity. And that might simply come down to the way in which those processes were different, right? Like Lot took 2 years to write on and off, whereas the novel was just like a sort of like 2.5 year, just like sit down and do the same thing over and over again. But I wonder if there are pros and cons to both approaches, or if they're just simply different approaches that are different sides of the same conversation, you know, if they're like circling around the same ideas and approaching each of those themes that they attempt to cover in different ways. I don't know that I know the answer to that. I think I'd have to write more to figure that out and read more.
And for those who are just listening to this now and thinking novel, do you want to, the novel comes out this fall, correct?
Yeah, it's supposed to come out on October 6th.
And the title for the audience?
It's Memorial. Riverhead will also be releasing it.
I'm curious, in the process of putting this together, if you felt like your collection was in conversation with any other literary works or any other art in general.
Yeah, I think that on my end, when insofar as I think of an audience at all when I'm writing, generally, immediately I'm thinking of something that I would enjoy reading, or something that I don't think has been done the way that I would like to see it. I think that's my immediate concern, like just sort of conversations that I'm having with myself that I would like to see resolved if I haven't seen them elsewhere. I think outside of that, it's my friends' stories that I think that they would enjoy, or something that I think would make them laugh. That's usually my sort of barometer, because of, you know, they're really cool folks. So if there's something, if they enjoy it, then like I would probably be quite all right with however it's received going forward. And I think that the tertiary concern that's circling that are, for a lot at least, the works of Jamaica Kincaid, the works of Nicola Yoon, Alexia Authors' collection, works by Patricia Engels, works by Sandra Cisneros. I was really into the works of Natsuo Quirino while I was writing a lot, just the ways in which they were able to mold so many different voices within the same physical communities that were experiencing the same reality, so to speak, without getting too woo-woo. But within those, they had their own concerns, they had their own loves, they had their own fears, they had their own interests, dislikes, and so on. And the way in which all of them were needed in order to make their respective communities work, in order to make the narrative work. So I had those collections and those authors in mind as I was writing this particular book, but also like I thought quite a lot about film, because I think that I don't really watch movies in a scholarly way at all, but I do watch quite a lot of movies. And as I was writing a lot, movies that I turned to quite often were Moonlight, for example, Spa Night, for example. I watched Tokyo Story quite a few times. I watched Yi, which is a film that's probably my favorite film. I watched that quite a few times. I watched Girlhood, and the ways in which those narratives also were not very loud, so to speak, but that had no impact on the resonance of the emotional weight that each of those films had. And the way that that emotional weight cascaded throughout each of their arcs was something that was deeply inspiring and just like super cool. And it was something that I wanted to, I don't know, when I started writing the collection, if I thought there was something I'd be successful at, and I still don't know that if I was successful at it, but it was some, I wanted to sort of parallel the flexibility of those narratives, right? Like the ways in which a quiet conversation or a scene that could be viewed as a quiet conversation could in fact have the emotional resonance of like a, I don't know, like a bank robbery or something that might be more explicitly notable in a narrative. I don't think that there's a direct relationship between the loudness of a scene and the loudness of its emotional weight.
Well, I think we are at the end of our time, unfortunately, although I could listen to you talk about this book for a lot longer. But thank you so much for making some time for us to have this conversation today. And for those of you listening at home, tune in on, I'm just going to make sure I get this right, Thursday, April 16th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. Mountain Time, for the announcement of the Aspen Words Literary Prize winner. And you can also visit aspenwords.org or follow the hashtag AspenLitPrize on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Thank you very much, Bryan.
Thank you, Alex. It's an honor and a privilege.